Thank you. Morning, colleagues. Nice to see you all in the room. Welcome back to Councillor Henry. It's nice to see you. We open the meeting looking at the minutes of the last meeting held on the 26th of July. Any comments or observations on those minutes? Can I assume that they're a true record? Are we all happy with those? Thank you. Second item, apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies this morning?
Thank you, Chairman. We don't have any apologies, but we do have two substitutions. So Councillor Barnfather replaces Councillor John O'Lee for this meeting, and Councillor Daniel Williamson replaces Councillor Deakin for this meeting only as well.
Welcome to both of you. Thank you for substituting. Next item is declarations of interest by members and officers. Do I have any declarations of interest by members? Any declarations by officers this morning? No? Thank you. So into the substance of the meeting. The first report, item 4, is the Children Looked After Governance Board Terms of Reference. There are two recommendations for this report on page 11.
And I second those, Chair.
I'll move them. Keen this morning. Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Do I have any comments or questions on this particular report? No, deafening silence. So thank you for your work on this, Lawrence. I think the terms of reference indicate the roles of those individuals who will participate in the board. That's on page 14 of the papers. So Councillor Anderson will chair this. I would just ask colleagues in the other parties to liaise with Lawrence to nominate your... Sorry, Councillor Henry's looking at me.
Yeah,
do you already have nominations,
yes,
Councillor Henry?
Councillor Callaghan will be joined from our group.
Thank you. Okay. Councillor Meakin.
So Councillor Deakin will be representing our party and I'll deputise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Henry, do you want to offer a deputy at this point?
Not at the moment, but if we need it, then Councillor Walsh will step in.
Thank you. You have a note of that, Mr. Jones. Thank you. Well, if there are no other comments and questions, can I take that one to the vote? All of those in favour? Nobody against? Thank you. The next item, item 5, is changes to the staffing establishment Adoption East Midlands. There is one recommendation on page 20 of your papers, which I move.
And I second that, Chair.
Thank you. Do I have any questions or comments on this paper? Councillor Welsh.
Yeah, we welcome this report and we will be supporting it. We welcome the recommendations. We did, however, as a Labour group, and I know that you will be aware of this, continue to highlight the impact on the pandemic with waiting times with regards to adoption and the drop in families seeking to adopt and the huge backlog that there are in the courts and the huge impact that that is having and could have in the future. I know this is a national problem, not just a Nottinghamshire issue. I just think there needs to be a degree of greater urgency from the government with regards to this as well, because it is a growing problem and will have a further financial impact on Nottinghamshire County Council, no doubt.
Mr. Edwards, would you like to comment on that? Because I know that you deal with the courts on our behalf.
Yeah. Councillor Welch is correct. It is a national challenge. Colleagues are working really hard now to address the issues. I chair the local Family Justice Board, which covers Nottingham and Nottingham City and the Nottinghamshire courts. And we're meeting again on Wednesday. We're still, we're working really hard to address the issue. But the reality of it is that COVID has caused quite a serious backlog in the children's courts. and some children's adoption plans and care proceedings are being delayed and will continue to be delayed for some time. And that's a combination of the backlog that grew up through COVID and a lack of judicial time. But yes, it is. We are doing our best to address it.
Thank you. Councillor Barnfather.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This issue actually arose at a different meeting last week, and the leader has agreed to write to the Lord Chancellor's Department, stressing the urgency for the appointment of a new judge to be able to adjudicate on these cases, so that we can actually speed up the process and hopefully clear the backlog as soon as possible.
Thank you, Councillor Barnfather. That's helpful. Any other comments on this paper? In which case we'll move to the vote. All of those in favour? Thank you. That's carried. Thank you. Item 6 this morning is the Children and Young People's Core Data Set for Performance and Finance for the first quarter. There is one recommendation on page 28 of your papers, which I move.
Thank you, Chair. I second that.
Thank you. You'll be aware that this particular paper or report provides committee with a summary of the performance and finance of the CYP for the first quarter of this financial year. The service does continue to see consistently good performance in completing child and family assessments, but the service is also aware that there's been a gradual reduction in the number of children in the county subject to child protection plans, and this has brought the authority in line with our statistical neighbours. The number of children for whom child sexual exploitation concerns have been identified and the numbers of children missing have increased since COVID-19 restrictions have relaxed. And although the data continues to evidence that the majority of children in care experience stable placements over the longer term, the decline during the past year in the actual percentage of children in care to which this applies is reflective of the impact of the pandemic on placement stability. There's an increase in time between a child entering care and moving in with their adoptive family, as you've already identified, Councillor Welsh. And this is due to delays in the court hearings due to the pandemic. So can I take any comments or questions on this report if you have any, members? Councillor Meakin.
Thank you, Chair. Just do we expect the process to get quicker as we move from COVID, and what is the financial impact on this authority?
Thank you. Can I take Councillor Callaghan's question and then I'll ask officers to respond? Thank you.
Right. Does this report adequately reflect the landscape of children and young people currently? Does it detail the looming crisis of children who may be suffering hidden abuse, neglect and poverty? And the last bit, do you believe that the lack of financial support from government is sufficiently mentioned in this document?
Thank you, Councillor Callaghan. I'll ask officers to respond and then I'll add comment if I may.
I think Councillor Meakin's question was about court time and delaying the courts. And yeah, okay. It's difficult to predict when that will be resolved. Well, it depends on reducing the backlog, which depends on the availability of judicial time, and both are sort of issues that are a little bit outside of the council's control at the minute, although Councillor Barnfather's indicated that there is going to be some political pressure. I'm confident everyone's working really, really hard, and the judges that are working flat out to get the cases done, as are the advocates and the social workers. The additional cost of the council will be in terms of foster care for children who are still in foster care that perhaps would have been adopted. There will be legal costs and social work costs because cases aren't progressing, and if a case delays for 6 months, then the advocates for the parents or the advocates for the grandparents are going to want to be reassessed. And, you know, it's a judicial decision whether to do that or not. But every time there is a reassessment, there'll be more costs for the council. So over time, the costs will continue to increase. There has been some COVID money into the council to cover some of those additional costs as a consequence of COVID from central government. Did that answer? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there is. Yeah. The question of hidden harm is a real challenging one, because the very nature of it, you don't know it. you don't know it's there. I think what's happened since Easter, since the schools went back after Easter, is that we've seen an increased amount of referrals, not just from schools, but from all of the professionals that are involved in keeping children as safe as they can be. So GPs, health visitors, midwives, the police, and the MASH is at the busiest time it's ever been. There's another report later about the challenges to the MASH and the demand on the service. I think that indicates two things: that people are anxious about hidden harm and are referring a lot of things in to social care, some of which, on reflection, they perhaps didn't need to refer in, but people are worried about children, so are. And the other bit is that, yes, we are uncovering some hidden harm. And anecdotally, locally and nationally, we're reporting that when cases do get referred, they're actually more complicated, perhaps because of the harm that was caused during the time when children weren't being seen as much as they needed to be. In Nottinghamshire, I think we did a really, really good job. All the children on child protection plans that we had throughout the pandemic, we saw on a regular basis, face to face. Social workers wearing PPE, and all children that were open, we had contact with them and their carers at least once a week. So I think we did as good a job as we could have done for the children that we knew about at the time of the pandemic. Of course, what we couldn't do is know about the children that weren't on our books and weren't being referred. And a lot of those are coming through the system now.
Councillor Welsh, you have a question.
I think Lawrence Jones answered it last time and actually provided me with quite a lot of information with regards to this post committee, so thank you for that. It's with regards to sexual exploitation, again with regards to children and young people, and I noticed that you mentioned, Councillor Taylor, that there'd been a rise again, is that right? I was just wondering if the stats were still the same with regards to the fact that a very significant amount of those were 15 to 16-year-old girls stroke young women, and whether that was actually still the case, because that still niggles on my mind and actually bothers me, and I'm just wondering if there's any more further information as how as a county, or if there's anyone else I could perhaps contact with regards to actually how we're dealing with that, because that's significant, and I don't think it should be ignored. That's my first thing, and as I said, Lawrence actually did provide me with a lot of information post last committee, and it was really, really useful. My second question is with regards to the further adaptation to services in children and young people. So nationally, for example, even in Greater Manchester, people are coming together with regards to children's services and assessing how actually the needs of children is actually changing, and certain areas are escalating more than others. So, for example, in schools, teenagers, we're seeing a rise in mental health issues. So it's how we adapt some of our services to cope with that. Early years are seeing language delays with children that are going to nursery school, and that's just not anecdotal. That's what, school leaders are saying, that there's a catch-up issue. And I just wondered where the plan is for children, young people post-pandemic with regards to this, and when that will be coming to this Children, Young People's Committee, because we're getting further and further into normality and this whole levelling up, but it will be really useful to see a plan as to what is actually going to happen with children, young people services to cope for those rising needs.
Thank you, Councillor Welsh. I mean, I think I'd comment on the first question in terms of CSE, there is a difference between saying that CSE concerns have been raised for children and whether upon investigation those perceived risks exist for that particular child. So possibly Lawrence will pick up on the stats around that, and then I think Mr. Edwards will answer the second question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad the information provided was helpful. Unfortunately, we haven't had a new set of data, so although we continually update that, that information normally comes back to committee every 6 months. So but generally the picture of recognising that girls in their mid-teenage years are at risk is a long-term one. That's not a particular blip in the data. That's been a fairly consistent point over the years, that they are a group who are at risk, but are also well identified, and often the issue actually is more around perhaps boys of the same age not being recognised as much as it is that we've got girls who are identified. So although it's important to note and know what we're doing about it, it's also important to note what we don't know as much as what we do. The Safeguarding Partnership received a very similar report to the one that came to committee, and that kind of joint working with health, police and other partners is kind of at the core of what we're trying to do. And you'll see in the annual report and the annual priorities for the Safeguarding Partnership that sexual exploitation will continue to be recognised in there as a priority for working together. Just in terms of the issues around kind of long-term planning and recovery, there's a kind of network depending on what the area of recovery is. The Local Resilience Forum and the subgroups, there's a recovery subgroup of the Local Resilience Forum that crosses both the county and the city and all public services. So there's some high-level recovery plans trying to have a look at what the risks are during recovery. I don't think generally there's been sight of this here, and it was going to the previous 3Rs committee, the one that was actually dealing with COVID. I'm not quite sure about the placement of those reports now, but I can have a look at that and come back to you and let you know where they're being reported in. There's a lot of work that's been done through the formation of the kind of the reviewed integrated care system, particularly around children's, and we have now got a setup around children's planning, which again will bring certainly health and local authority much more closely together in terms of some of that planning than we've had over previous years. So that's positive, and the Safeguarding Partnership itself is going to play a key role along with other bodies like the Schools Forum in terms of planning more generally. I think the point that you make around the fact, is there a single place where you can see all of that recovery plan? There probably isn't a single place at the moment because there's quite a number of strands to it. But we can have a conversation about how we can make that more visible, perhaps at a future committee.
Thank you. My issue is around the budget, and I know we are only in Q1 so far, and there's a forecast of quite substantial overspend. So what I'd like to know is that there's someone getting to grips of this budget, because it's a constant overspending, not just because of COVID. Just demonstrate to me that there's someone trying to get the grip of this and trying to manage this a little bit better because of the constant overspend that seems to be presented every time.
Thank you. I think I will probably answer in the way that I tend to answer, and then I'll leave it for officers to comment more specifically. As you know from your own background, there is no choice to addressing the needs of a child in need. Children who need to come into care need to come into care, and if that means spending money, that's what we must do. I can tell you that there are constant conversations about the scale of the Children's Services budget overspend. I mean, within this particular report, we're looking at a forecast overspend of 5.989 million. The majority of that, 4.75, is coming from the additional COVID grant streams. Clearly, that won't be coming through to us as time moves on and we move beyond COVID. So we're looking at the moment at 1.2 million overspend at this point. I'm not at all naive to the significance of these overspends year on year, and you'll be aware that we do face some particular challenges using external fostering agencies, the cost of external placements. So the reassurance from me is yes, people are scrutinising this constantly. We are a demand-led service and we cannot not provide care to those who need it, but I'll leave officers to respond in the context of how we deal with that. Thank you. Sorry, Councillor Barnfather, you have a question also.
Just a couple of observations, if I may, Chair. The administration are aware, obviously, of the pressures on the children and young people's budget, as outlined by Councillor Henry. And indeed, we have established an oversight panel that are currently reviewing all the costs incurred by that department and the pressures on that department moving forward. So that that panel is chaired by the chair of the Finance Committee. So there is effectively an objective external look at how budgets are being spent, the budgetary demand. Is the budget right in the first place? Do we need to increase that budget? Are there areas in which there are potential savings to be made? So I'm just pointing out really that you're absolutely right. There is an overspend. We are aware of it. We are reviewing it. It's an objective external look at that. And I sit on that panel as a member of the senior leadership team. And just picking up on Councillor Welsh's point, if I may, Chair, obviously mental health issues affect children of all ages. I suspect primarily as a result of the COVID issues. It tends to probably be more secondary age children than primary age children. And I'm certainly aware that most schools now, which are of course within the academy chains rather than within the direct remit of the local authority, in the way that they have always appointed a senior member of staff for safeguarding issues and a dedicated safeguarding governor, most of the academy trusts now actually appoint a senior member of staff to lead on mental health issues affecting their young people, and equally there is now a nominated governor on most governing bodies that liaises with that member of staff. And indeed there are, I think it's the Carnegie Award off the top of my head, there are all sorts of sort of bronze, silver, gold standards now that the schools look to achieve, for which they're able to benchmark that the efforts that the individual academies are making. I hope that's helpful. Cheers.
Councillor Welsh, you want to comment?
No, I totally agree with Chris Barnfather, Councillor Barnfather. It wasn't trying to be disparaging towards schools in any way. I think the challenges for us here in Nottinghamshire is when schools can't deal with that issue of mental health, and there isn't necessarily a place for those children and young people to go. I think schools are doing great. I think our youth services are really doing great as well in the communities. It's that next level with regards to as perhaps pushing for more the health angle of it rather than the schools. But I agree, schools are making huge efforts.
Thank you, Councillor Welsh. Councillor Meakin, you have a question.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask specifically about the financial impact of the temporary closure of Minster View at Southwell? This was closed in December 2020 due to concerns over best practice and COVID-related issues. This has cost this authority 1.2 million overspend so far, as outlined in the Financial Committee last week.
Yeah, there is a £1.2 million overspend because of Minster View. There's an underspend in other areas because of Minster View as well, of about £350,000 because staff have been redeployed and people aren't using. But the reality of it is we're talking about £900,000 that the Minster View closure has cost. Now there were two reasons why Minster View closed that were interrelated. But the first reason was that there were 17 people from Minster View all off work at the same time with COVID, or were tested, had to self-isolate. At the same time as that, we started to identify concerns about practice at Minster View that we didn't feel met the standard of care that we would want it to reach. So the two things came together. First of all, there weren't the staff, and there were concerns about practice. And how can you safely meet the needs of children when, first of all, you haven't got any staff and you're concerned about some of the quality, some of the practice. So we took a very difficult decision to close the home. Staff were redeployed to other areas, and we're now looking at proposals about the reopening of the facilities at Minsterview and to get back to where we were. And very shortly, we'll be talking to members about a range of proposals, and we'll also be having a full consultation with the parents of the children that were at Minsterview that have moved on, because it's really, it's really important to do that. So it was a difficult time. It wasn't a pleasant decision to make. It has had financial consequences. But in the end, I think that the circumstances that were there at the time of the closure left us with very little option, really. And I think no one would want us to have a children's home that we felt might be unsafe. So it was a difficult decision, but I think in the end, it's a decision that I regret, but I think it was the right decision.
Thank you. Councillor Barney, did you have a question?
Just a very quick comment in response to Councillor Barnfather's and Councillor Welch's comments. The mental health challenges arising out of COVID, I'm sure we're all aware, it's not lost on any of us, are significant, as Councillor Welch has indicated. And of course, last Friday was World Suicide Prevention Day, and I was just struck again by the numbers of people who are affected to the point where they're pushed to take their own lives. It's absolutely shocking. And I just wanted to really just bring into this committee the overlap that there is with the Health Scrutiny Committee that Councillor Welch also sits upon, where we will be doing a deep dive and review cross-party, which I think is the right place to be looking at these very real and alarming statistics, what we can do as a county to address and work together to meet this acute and desperate need. And that will very much also be focusing on children and young people. And I very much hope that Councillor Welch and I can play a role in looking at the evidence, looking at the situation in which we find ourselves coming out of COVID, and seeing what we can do as an authority to address that with the means as afforded by central government. But just wanted to bring that overlap to this committee.
Thank you, Councillor Barney. I think certainly I and I guess members of this committee would be grateful if yourself and Councillor Welch will actually press the case for children and young people's mental health provision. I'm aware that Councillor Anderson will sit within her role on the regional children and young people's health and wellbeing panel. So that's something that's led by our health colleagues. So that's part of her remit going forward. So I suppose really just to ask the three of you in your respective contacts elsewhere to press the case and press the message. These are not bodies I sit on, but to have strong voices representing us in those other places is obviously making the best case for children and young people in this county, and I'd be grateful if you would all continue to do that. Do I have any other questions on this paper? In which case we'll take it to the vote. All of those in favour? Thank you, colleagues. Item 7 is the communication strategies for first admission to primary school and transfer from infant to junior and primary school from September 2022, and for Nottinghamshire's statutory consultation on the admission arrangements for 2023-24. There are 3 recommendations on pages 38 and 39, which I move.
Thank you, Chair. I second those and reserve the right to speak.
Thank you, Councillor Smith. Do I have any questions on this particular paper? Councillor Welch and then Councillor Williamson.
Yeah, it's just to ask how confident we are with regards to school places in general, and that we've got the school places that we need, and also how it's an ongoing battle. I know for the county council to make people realise you need to put more than one school down, and etc. etc. I'm looking the fact that where I live in Gedling, there's not a school in Gedling. I've visited all schools in Gedling over my time. There isn't a school in Gedling that I wouldn't send my own child to. Not everybody feels that way in other areas, etc. People have a particular school that they want to go to and only put one school down, and I know that's an ongoing challenge. I think us as members have a bit of a role to play with regards to this communication strategy as well, because it does avoid some of those issues where someone doesn't get the school and it becomes a problem where they're having to go out of catchment. So I think we all have a role to play.
Can I take Councillor Williamson's question first and then? Thank you.
Thank you. Looking initially at this report, I do quite welcome it. School places and difficulties in attaining those places is quite a significant issue around Ashfield. Just having a look through the bits I can see, particularly through the communication strategy, I'm just wondering how the communication strategy set out differs from previous years, or is this in effect, are we just being asked to rubber stamp the same approach that this council's taken previously, as I would assume that a lot of what it's suggesting we do here, we do anyway. And also for my benefit, can I just ask if there's been a rise in education appeals and where these appeals are coming from, and whether this may lead to a review in school numbers, especially across North Nottinghamshire. I do think it's worth noting that the number of new houses is obviously rising dramatically in the county. So are we seeing a rise in appeals from areas where this is growing?
Thank you. And if I may, I think Councillor Callaghan indicated. Do you still wish to speak? Thank you.
Yeah, I was just looking at how can we support children who require a specialist school placement, you know, because we're struggling in Nottinghamshire to offer specialist school placements for children who are asking at this moment in time, and what is the plan going forward for that?
Thank you, Councillor Callaghan. I mean, I think that's a slightly different subject. If I just come back to colleagues first. Officers will obviously answer in terms of pupil place planning and whether we've got enough places. You will be aware that planning is done across place planning areas. So there are shifting sands constantly in what the population numbers are and how we plan. A debate that was had frequently during the last administration, and Councillor Owen, as past chair of this committee, spoke very stridently on it, was the exercising of 4 places on an application form, and we have tested and better tested whether we can compel parents to exercise 4 choices. We cannot compel parents. It is not legal for us to do so, is the advice we've been repeatedly given. So we're very much carrot and not stick, because that's the only way we can approach it. I know Councillor Smith did reserve his right to speak, and I maybe invite you to do so later, Councillor Smith. We have been looking with officers at ways to entice more robustly, more applications, more expressions on an application form. So that's something that we are looking at, including, I think we've got some new technology coming in the next year or 2, because most applications are online now. To Councillor Williamson, paraphrasing slightly, but I think what you're testing is our comms policy same old, or are we learning lessons when we experience problems? And I would say to you, yes, we are. Everything is evolving with time and effort. So we are, again, Councillor Smith and Marion and I have spoken a lot about this. How do we encourage people? What do we do differently in our comms? So it is an evolving process. It's certainly not perfect, but it is evolving, and we continue to work on it. And to Councillor Callaghan, and probably best leaving your question to officers, because I do think the send place planning is a different issue to what's covered in this particular report. But if I could ask Marion to just respond on the 3 sets of questions.
Okay. There is obviously a relationship between school admissions and strategic school place planning. And last year, 93.4% of Nottinghamshire parents secured their first preference, with about 98.8% one of their 4 preferences, which suggests that broadly, the sufficiency of school places broadly reflects the demand. Schools which are oversubscribed one year are different to the schools that are oversubscribed the following year, because as Councillor Taylor said, Children are not born in neat units of 30 children per area, per catchment area. So you always have fluctuation year on year. And that's why you have planning areas, particularly in places around towns and conurbations where you've got children whose parents may not want to secure their child at the local catchment school, for example, but for various reasons may want to send their child to the next one, possibly because grandparents live there or the aunt lives there. And if a school place is available, then clearly that child is offered it. So broadly speaking, we have a good sufficiency, and most local authorities would look on envy at these admissions figures on first offer day. They are often slightly better in the reality because you've made reference to or there are a lot of primary academies now who are their own admissions authority, and you'll need to ask them with regards to the appeals, because we wouldn't always necessarily have. So I can't answer the appeals question off the top of my head. I'm not sure that there has been more appeals, in truth, actually. I think probably not. That's what it feels like from the point of view. But obviously, it may vary. One year a school may have many appeals, whereas the following year they may have practically none, and that's the nature of school admissions. With regard to funding in the light of, say, basic need, i.e. pupil growth, the DFE requires all local authorities to make a return of their data every year. That didn't happen last year because of COVID, so this year will be the first time in 2 years, and that process identifies and confirms our figures with the DFE. Now, historically, we've had good confirmation that broadly our projections aren't predictions, projections are based on so many variables that we broadly get admissions figures like this. So you should have some reassurance that we are able to plan where they are needed. But you know there are pressures because there have been papers brought to committee with regard to pressures in Rushcliffe with regard to secondary and the funding that will be required in relation to that. Thirdly, I think your third point was about a comms strategy has just been the same old, same old. Sometimes we shouldn't knock the same old, but councillor, because they're a legal requirement, and so all parents who are known are actually posted at great expense information about first admissions. That happens every year. So we wouldn't want to change that because that would disadvantage parents. So that doesn't mean that all parents necessarily respond. As Councillor Taylor says, almost all families make an online application, and that is good, and we want that to continue. So if we want that to continue, we need the comms strategy to continue to engage with that. It does evolve. It might look the same, but it evolves. We send update to members, asking members to promote school admissions and deadlines in their news bulletins, and we write to MPs asking them to do the same. And the press always comes at us. So we do as much as we can. We are looking at other software, but that is a year or two down the line when the contracts are renewed. Whether or not that picks up every single person, I guess it won't. But we strongly urge you in all your communications to urge parents to express multiple preferences and to make a preference where they have the highest chance in the oversubscription criterion. So that basically means their catchment or where their sibling is. So it's really quite important to those who promote this. And we'll need to take the question. I can only tell you about the appeals that we know about. It's not in my area, it's in Democratic Services. But I don't think my officers have been as busy with appeals as they have in previous years. And the housing is similar to the basic need. We work closely with our property colleagues to make sure that developers contribute and expand and build schools where they're required. And the special needs is actually a different paper, but we have brought papers to say that there is a demand, and we've been allocated some capital money for SEND, and that will be invested in trying to produce more special places even now. We have provided about 500-600 additional special places in the last 3 years, but clearly we need more.
Councillor Smith, did you want to comment at all?
Thank you, Chairman. I think Marion has answered all the points I was going to allude to. Just on comms and what's changed, I think the world's gone social media mad, particularly during the pandemic, and we are pushing messages out massively on social media now than we ever did before. And in the comms that we approved, Councillor Taylor and I have approved for this coming academic year, there's going to be case studies in that to explain. This goes on to Councillor Welsh's point actually, but as well as comms as raised by you, there's going to be case studies that go out to families to explain what happens with child A if they only use one preference, or child B who uses 4. And I think that's something new that's coming out that we're going to push with. But I am working closely with Mrs. Clare on changing our online system. The contract's up soon and we need to get in reminders there. We can't force people to use all 4 preferences, but if you go on there and you haven't read anything, you just want to apply for your child's school, if you get a reminder to use all 4, that might reduce the number of people who aren't. So we're working closely with IT on bringing that in once the contract's up. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? No? In which case we can move to the vote. All of those in favour? Thank you, that's carried. Item 8 is the Fair Access Protocol Statutory Consultation update. There is one recommendation on page 43 of the papers, which I move.
Thank you, Chairman. I second and reserve the right to speak.
Thank you. Do we have any comments or questions on this paper? In which case we'll go straight to the vote. All of those in favour? Thank you, that's carried. Item 9 is a report on the outcome of the consultation on options for the future of North Clifton Primary School and a response to the petition to keep the school open, which was presented to a recent full council meeting. There are 3 recommendations on page 51 of the papers, which I move.
Thank you, Chairman. I second those and reserve the right to speak.
Thank you, Councillor Smith, and I welcome Councillor Dobson to the meeting, who may choose to speak, whether at this point or whether later in the debate. Councillor Dobson. Of course, thank you. Do I have any questions on this? Thank you. Councillor Welsh, would you like to begin?
Yeah, it's a few questions stemming from this, really. Obviously, there was a lot of local people were firmly against the closure of this school, which is understandable in so many ways, and the fact that many people want to send their kids to the local school. It makes sense if you're a working parent or a not working parent. I understand the financial constraints, though, with regards to having a small school and there not being the children to go it. What always worries me when a small school closes is that there is a new housing estate that's built, you know, a couple of years down the line, and suddenly it's like, oh, if we hadn't have closed that school when we need all of those places. Some of that's in hindsight, but this has probably all been checked out, but I was just wondering about that with regards to that. And then the other thing is, this seems like a really simple question to ask, but I think it's important that we know as a committee. Recommendation number 3 recommends a review of the small school estate. I was just wondering, what is a small school? How many pupils? Is it size of building? Is it how many pupils or students? And the seriousness around this really is, we have got schools in Gedling that are worried because they don't have as many pupils attending that school as they do in other schools. So because are they classed as a small school in Gedling? Is it going to be done in area? And also, how many schools have we got in this? Do we know yet, is my other question. Do we know how many small schools we've got? Do we know how we're going to assess what is a small school and what isn't a small school? I am being a bit colloquial with regards to this because I've got good relationships with the head teachers in Gedling, and I want to offer some of them assurances that people aren't going to be knocking at the door reviewing those schools. So yes, it'd be good to get some clarity on what a small school is, and and whether that can change over the course of a year as well. Does that make sense?
Yes, sense? It does. Thank you. I will ask Marion to respond in a moment, but I think from an elected member's perspective, I represent 17 parishes in a rural patch at the northernmost outposts of the county. The majority of the schools in my villages are small in number, small in size. I think I would be at pains to reassure the idea of reviewing the small schools estate is not with the view to looking at how many we've got, let's say arbitrarily 50 across the county, and saying, well, can we cull that down to 40 because that's more costly. This is not a review with a view to making change. This is a review because the situation in North Clifton has brought to the fore the potential vulnerabilities of a number of similar schools. And therefore, this may not be the only school for whom we have to explore opportunities in order to make it sustainable. So in this instance, North Clifton approached us as the local authority to say that they were feeling vulnerable, concerns about sustainability, which has put us into a process in order to explore ways in order to make them sustainable. So it's not all about looking at a way to close them. It's about, if they are at this point in their thinking, what do we do to potentially make them more sustainable? North Clifton has simply shone a bit of a spotlight on our thinking that this might not be the only conversation we would be faced with were we not to take a proactive look now at all of the small schools across the county, with a view to saying what are the potential common threat factors, if you like, whether it's dropping populations, whether it's issues with finance. So this is let's call it a preemptive starting point that has come about because of the particular focus that North Clifton has drawn on the subject, and it would be remiss of us not to take this opportunity to begin looking, but it's certainly not a review with a view to closing schools. So that would be the first message I would suggest you take back to those schools with whom you say you have that close relationship. This is not about a review with a view to closing down. I'll probably leave it there and ask Marion to actually comment. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, may I just say, from a communications aspect, the fact that you've put that on a report about a school that is going, that where decisions are being made, that's why people are drawing that conclusion from it, if that makes sense. Because you're saying a review on a report about North Clifton, which seems to be going in a certain way, that's why people are quite worried about what this review actually is. And the fact is, there isn't really much detail in here about what the review is and what you're going to do. So some of this is about how we communicate this.
Yeah, I think I would disagree with you over that, insofar as the very fact that there is no detail within this report other than to make the recommendation that we commence a review, because there is no other dialogue no other conversation so far. The review will have and open the conversation, and there's nothing else in the report, in my view, that suggests that we're going to close North Clifton School. Quite the opposite. Everything within this report so far, which reprises the responses to the early consultation and engagement that's been done, has been positive and has been about finding ways to make this school sustainable and have a future. So I would disagree with your perception of the message that the report communicates. Councillor Smith, you were indicating, and then I will ask Marion to actually respond to Councillor Welch.
Thank you, Chair. Just to welcome this report, I'd also like to thank officers Marion and Colin, who I know spent many evenings out in North Clifton. And also, I'm really pleased Councillor Dobson's with us today, because I know from feedback I received from officers about these consultation meetings that Councillor Dobson was fundamental in securing new governors to help with the viability of the school. So I think that's really good. Just on Councillor Welsh's point, because I understand the perception of that, we need to be absolutely clear that actually this paper is on a consultation that's taken place into a future of a small school. We're not saying it's closing. We needed to look at the options, and one of the outcomes of that consultation is that this authority needs to better understand how we can support our small schools. We want them to stay open, and to do that, we need to find out, as Councillor Taylor's put, what are the difficulties that those small schools are facing, and how can this local authority fix those gaps? And that may be around bus transport, which was a big thing in the consultation, or anything else. And so that's why it's in this paper, because this paper isn't a paper to close a school. This paper is on a consultation of a future of a small school, and that's highlighted the problem that we need to understand across the whole board of the local authority what more we can do. And I think I'm really pleased that we're not closing this school, which is item 1 of the recommendations, but item 3 is crucial into this authority supporting our rural schools, and I look forward to working with officers on that to better protect them and their viability. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Smith. Councillor Dobson, you were indicating, would you like to speak before or after Marion?
Yeah.
Please go
I
ahead.
think probably now, Chairman. First of all, thank you, Chairman, for allowing me to come, and members. I appreciate it. And I first of all would like to pay a really big thank you to Corporate Director. He's not here, he's on leave. Marion Clay and Jonathan Smith, who have worked really hard with me to enable this report to come out like it is, and recommendations. I think, in all fairness to Councillor Welsh, you are looking at it at the wrong angle, and I agree with the chairman. I think it's brought to the attention of this authority that we have a huge amount of rural schools, and like the chairman, I represent 14 areas that have rural schools, and I think we've got to look at them. What you will be pleased to know, since we've had those public meetings, and they were very well supported, considering we were in the middle of COVID and all the rest of it. But we had 3 on the trot, and Marion kept getting out the coffee, and we kept nibbling at the biscuits, and we got out of that 3 new governors, 2 ordinary governors and 1 LA governor, which was really good because people showed that they were keen and wanted to progress this school. And also what we got people interested and realizing that if they don't do something, things will happen that they don't want to happen. So, wearing my other hat, Chairman, I have asked Newark and Sherwood District Council, and they took it to committee last week, to actually look at doing some building in North Clifton. I've been talking to Marion about this, I think possibly for 6 years. And at long last, Newark and Sherwood have now agreed, because it fits in with their community-led plan, and I'm sure Roger Jackson will agree with me, wearing his other hat. It fits in with their community-led plan, and if it does, it means that we can, if we can build a dozen new houses in a small rural village, then we have the opportunity of actually, by saying you can't come and buy a house unless you produce a baby or 3. But having said that, you know, we are going to try and encourage young families to come, and that's what it's all about. I'm also right on the border of Lincolnshire, literally as you are, Madam Chairman, and you're sort of also North Yorkshire. But right on the border, West Lindsey have got a huge planning application in, and some of those children or some of those parents will come and look at North Clifton School, which incidentally got a good, and I know it's ready for a new Ofsted, but it was only 1 point off an outstanding. So it has some really good opportunities for young people who won't necessarily or can't necessarily fit into large, big schools, but really will perform in small schools. So I think this is a really good paper. I welcome it. I thank you all very much indeed, but I really do thank the staff for working with me to achieve what I think we can achieve. We've now got an after-school club started last week, and that's going to bring in 1 or 2 extra. We only need 3. to make us viable. So, you know, I shall rally round the troops again, but thank you all very much. But seriously, I do think, Michelle, you've not got it quite right. I think it is talking about looking at the whole of your rural schools or our rural schools. And I think that's something that does need to be looked at, Chairman, not with a view to closing them, but how you can sustainably keep them going, as the Chairman says. Thank you. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Councillor Dobson. I come from a family of sort of cliches and old expressions, and my grandmother always used to say new house, new family, new baby. I'm not sure we can actually compel the purchases, but yeah, it's certainly a notion that resonates with me. Marion, would you like to comment at all?
I'll just keep it brief. There's no, and I can't find the information to your specific questions quickly enough, but we'll send it. There is no national definition to what is a small school, but we have a lot of small schools. That's schools with, say, fewer than 100 pupils, schools with fewer than 75 pupils, schools with fewer than 50 pupils, and schools with fewer than 40 pupils. There is, I think, the other. If I just remember, the next smallest school is actually a very small school in Ashfield, ironically, just on the hub. We have lots of small schools and lots of rural schools. The presumption by the Department for Education and Government is there is a presumption against the closure of rural schools because of the critical role a school plays in its community. And so there is every reason to work again. Over the last 15 years or so, in various jobs that I have been in, I can think of at least 2 other comprehensive small school reviews. It's something you need to keep coming back to. I would suggest that the small school review is somewhat different to head teachers managing a declining a cohort, because the birth rate is down. So the birth rate is slightly declining and has done for the last couple of years, but that's part of the natural ebb and flow of population cohorts. So no national definition. We have got a grid. I just can't find it quickly enough, but we have a lot of schools. I think you'd be surprised as to how many schools are actually small schools. No national definition for what is small. But the challenge also becomes, we have several small schools who now work in collaboration. They can do lots of things to help their communities. So that's what I think we want to do. And I can add into the notes the grid with the latest numbers. We know all that.
Thank you. Councillor Barnfather, you indicated.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think it's really important from a media perspective, if we have some media in the room, that we don't send out the wrong signal here. It's glass half full, glass half empty. Councillor Welsh sees hidden meanings in recommendation 3 here.
A point of clarity, I was asking a question. I didn't say there were hidden meanings. I was asking a question and explaining how I interpreted the court report. I wasn't saying it was the case. As a point of clarification before people start tarring me with some kind of bush here. I was merely stating that's what I thought, or people might think, which is why people have asked me the question to ask in this committee.
Thank you, Councillor Welsh. We appreciate the clarification. I think we have corrected your misconceptions, but if Councillor Barnfather would like to continue.
Thank you, Chair. Certainly there was a negativity in the question that was answered, as if there was some hidden agenda here. The agenda is very clear. The agenda is how can we sustain our small schools. I welcome Mrs Clay's reaffirmation of that, and I certainly welcome Councillor Dobson's involvement, because that's an example of how we can keep small schools open, how we can sustain them by local members becoming actively involved with schools which may be under threat, not through anything that this authority has done, but through declining populations or children or parents rather exercising their right, their freedom of choice. So it's very important that local members work with, and Councillor Welsh obviously has made that point, that she has a close relationship with her head teachers. So it's very important that local members use those close relationships to actually work with head teachers to make sure that we as an authority are able to sustain these schools, put in whatever support that we can as an authority, but ultimately it's down to the local community. They need to use the school. They need to make sure that their children attend local schools where they are a viable and attractive proposition. And the work that Councillor Dobson has been doing and the work that this authority has been doing is to make North Clifton an attractive proposition for parents who might otherwise have chosen another alternative where they're actually taking their children past this school to go to some outlying school. So I welcome the report. Recommendation 3 is open. It's open for the very reason that if you're going to review something, you don't actually review it when you've already come up with the answer. It's a review to look at how we can sustain schools, which are the very backbone of a rural community, and we are a rural county. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Barnpelt. I'm going to ask you to sub more often, particularly when I'm under the weather. Councillor Barney, you had a question.
I just wanted to make a positive comment in regard to all the thanks that have been projected towards officers, absolutely correctly, but also for you, the role you've done in bringing in 3 new school governors, and thanks to those particular 3 governors that will be the lifeblood of this new school. But I think I'd like to invite others to also join just for a moment to express our thanks and appreciation to governors across the county. I say this as my father has just served 25 years as the local authority governor at Sutton Bonington Primary School. He's just retired at the age of 76 years old. I know how hard governors work across this county, and I just wanted to put on record, I think the committee would support a vote of thanks and appreciation for school governors as well as officers.
Thank you, Councillor Barney. Well said. Picking up on your thread about school governors, there will be people in this room who are school governors. There will be colleagues in the respective political groups who are school governors. And I think probably a takeaway message from this committee today back to our colleagues is that we encourage those governors, those who are governors, to be very tuned into the needs of their schools, particularly if they're governors at small schools, because part of understanding the problems that they face will be that we hear that at council. So I know we're talking about a review which has not yet commenced, but there are other ways to bring that voice into the council through the respective colleagues who can actually tell us firsthand what they're experiencing on the ground. And if you've got any colleagues who aren't school governors, please tell them we always need them, and please encourage them to join up. If there are no more questions on this, then I'll take it to the vote. Confuse me then. All of those in favour? Thank you, that's carried. Item 10 is the proposed expansion of Carlton Llewellow's Academy. There is one recommendation on page 77, which I move.
I second that, Chairman, and reserve the right to speak.
Thank you, Councillor Smith. Do I have any questions or comments on this paper? Councillor Welsh.
Yeah, welcome the extra school places in Gedling. I think, Errol, did you say something about there was the cost of it had increased? I'm assuming that's because building materials, etc., in general has actually increased since the pandemic. I know that because my fella's a builder, and everything's more expensive or you can't get hold of it. I was just wondering, and actually Councillor Sam Smith probably will be able to answer this question. There were some issues with regards to where the entrances were or were not going to be, and quite a lot of concern about local residents about the road infrastructure around that and how it was going to impact them as neighbours. I know certainly during the Borough Council elections it was something that came up quite a lot. I was just wondering if that situation had been managed to be resolved in some way, just so we can look out for it with regards to a local issue as well. But yeah, really welcome this. I think it's fantastic that you're doing it as well.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments before I go to officers and Councillor Smith? No. Councillor Smith, would you like to comment from a local member point of view before I actually go to, I think it'd be Mr Gamble possibly answering on this one?
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks, Councillor Welsh, for the question. Bit of conflict of interest. I'm the district councillor for the area it's in, but not the county councillor. So I will vote for the extra school places in this meeting, but I voted against the actual entrance site. The entrance site is a Gedling Borough Council matter because it's a planning matter, and Gedling Borough Council are responsible for that. And the site has no bearing on the increase of costs on this report, just to assure you there. But the entrance has gone through as planned on the proposals and will be off Burton Road. And I know it will have a significant impact on my residents, and I'm sad about that. But the extra school places that come in return of it probably outweigh that. But yes, it's resolved.
Thank you, Councillor Smith. Mr. Gamble, would you like to pick up the other issues?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the price is higher than was previously approved. What we've done here is basically gone through different stages. That originally, when the requirement for extra spaces in this area were identified, we gave through grant 27,500 to the trust to look into their capability of the site to take the extra places, and that led to the last report to policy committee, which was saying, yes, effectively, we think from doing that level of feasibility work, we have a site here that will work. But then, as you'll note from the report, the policy committee gave them a chunk of money then to progress that design much further, to get through to planning, tender, etc., and then for us to give them the money subject to that being sufficient. So what they've done now is spent that significant extra money in taking all that planning further, dealing with the planning issues, Sport England issues. They've identified certain issues with services on and around the site which have been at greater cost, and as you say, there has been significant inflation in the construction industry. So all those things together have basically, they've spent that extra money on feasibility that have given them and come back and said, we can still achieve your pupil places in a design which is efficient and effective, which we've had checked by ARC, but our tendered figures now are showing that it's coming in at higher than was expected after we'd done the lower level feasibility 18 months ago. So that's where we are now.
Thank you, Mr. Gamble. Do we have any other questions or comments from members? I'll move that one to the vote then, please. All of those in favour? Thank you, that's carried. Item 11, also a school item, the proposed expansion of South Nottinghamshire Academy. There are two recommendations on page 81, which I move.
Thank you, Chair. I second that, and in doing so, welcome the extra 150 places this will provide. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Smith. Do I have any comments or observations on this paper? No? Thank you. Can I take this one straight to the vote? All of those in favour? That's also carried. Thank you. Item 12 is the proposed consultation on the use of Retford Central Children's Centre. There are two recommendations on page 90, which I move.
And I second those, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Do I have any comments, observations on this paper? Councillor Welsh.
Yeah, we've got a number of questions with regards to the Retford Children's Centre. We are a little nervous about this consultation, mainly because of what happened in Bassett Law, where the Children's Centre was closed without the member necessarily knowing about it. So we firstly the report's quite difficult to understand in part, so could you clarify what the authority would gain from option 2 with regards to the maternity? What would we gain from that? Can we see the proposed consultation framework for this prior to the consultation? How are you going to ensure comprehensive community engagement in the consultation, and in particular reach those harder to access families? With regards to the rent that's paid, fees from with regards to what is being paid now and what will be paid in the future, will that mean that we'll break even with regards to that building, or will it still kind of run at a loss? And the other question that I do have is this: with the fact that there's already been a decision made about a previous children's centre and we're seeing another children's centre issue coming up, is this part of a wider strategy regards to children's centres, or is it just that you've come into administration and as you're looking around the county, there's various issues coming up in various buildings? And last but certainly not least is there's a definite need for children's centres services across Nottinghamshire and in Retford. And as someone that was involved in the establishment of children's centres in the first place, I'm not convinced about services being out in the community. I believe that there should be a physical building and we should do more to encourage families into those physical buildings. I find it really odd that the choices between a children's centre or a family hub or a maternity hub, I find those choices quite bizarre and very, very different. But yeah, more detail on the consultation and perhaps a bit of a background as to why this children's centre, and are you assessing all children's centres across the county?
Thank you. I see that Irene has turned a camera on. I know you've been listening in the background. Couple of comments from me before I actually ask you to answer the specific points, Irene, if I may. Short answer to, is there a wider agenda? No, there isn't, certainly not in the negative sense that I'm taking from your question. Yes, there is constant and ongoing review of the use of children's centre buildings, and I'm aware that the way that service deliveries happened in the last 4 years has changed. Personally, I do adhere to the service delivery model. I am not attached to a building. Buildings do not deliver services, people do. So you and I may have a fundamental difference in ideology over that, but I'm stating my case clearly from the get-go. But there is no agenda to close buildings. There is a very strong agenda to deliver the best children's centre services we can, whether they are from buildings in some instances or through community-based models, whether that's in the home, in a village hall, wherever the need may arise. So I guess that's just being clear on statement of intent, if you like. I don't think the question with this one is whether it will run at a loss or break even. I think the figures in the report are talking about the costs of that building as opposed to whether it's profitable. They are simply stated as the facts, the costs to keep the building open. And you used the expression that you were nervous given a past history of closures in Bassetlaw, which happened without member knowledge. I believe you're referring to a centre that Councillor Fielding spoke about, I think. Rhodesia, yeah, that's right, that Councillor Fielding spoke about within the last year, 18 months. I will stand corrected by officers if my own understanding is flawed. But it is my belief that Councillor Fielding was fully aware, because she was a serving governor at the school that was seeking to take on those premises. So I think it's slightly disingenuous to suggest that the member was not aware of the changes that were potentially in play and which did ultimately come to pass. But I'll actually ask Irene to actually explain the facts that respond to the various elements of your question. Thank you. Irene, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'll try and take each of the questions, really. I think the first thing to say is that with either option, it means we will be using the building a lot more than we currently are. So the building became a spoke from our hub and spoke model, with the main site being Hallcroft in that area. What happened during COVID, we did continue to use the building, but it wasn't open every day. What happened because of COVID was the maternity service at Doncaster and Bassetlaw Hospital Trust needed a community site. They were already operating from that building, running midwifery clinics, and they needed a community site to prevent people having to go into hospital. That's been really successful. So they've approached us about taking on the whole building as a maternity hub, where they can carry on working with expectant parents and new parents, with some children's centre provision still in there. So that would be for family appointments. At that point, we thought, this is a good opportunity for us to consider the other option, which is a family hub. Now, family hubs, there will be a paper coming to committee in more detail around family hubs, but they're a national priority at the moment, with a lot of local authority areas creating family hubs using existing resources, whether that be a physical building or teams. What would happen with a family hub? It would be a service for 0 to 19-year-olds with other services delivered from that building. Again, we would use a hub and spoke model. So it could be that the Retford Central building becomes the hub, which is what we propose, with spokes being the local primary schools, the local secondary schools, CAB Bassett Law, all of those sorts of services that are already there would become spokes. The idea of the family hub model is that you are working in a far more integrated way. So there will be more team around the family meetings, there will be more data sharing, there will be more joint work with some families. So both options here actually bring a lot of benefits to Nottinghamshire and certainly to the communities in Retford. The consultation, we are happy to send the draft consultation questionnaire and the circulation list. We don't want to be criticised again, as we were for Rhodesia, for the lack of consultation. What happened in Rhodesia is we had very few responses. We still had a wide circulation list. We still invited people to do face-to-face focus groups, and yet people didn't engage in that. So we will, hopefully it will reassure you to know that we do try and we do send lots of information out. We've already engaged the CCG, for example. There'll be lots of information going out on social media, but also contacting the parish councillors, district councillors and county councillors. County councillors at the moment are fully briefed in the proposals, and a further briefing will be happening with them after today's meeting. The question about hard to reach groups, that's absolutely a priority for us, and we will continue with so the Young People's Service, they've developed with us a Young People's questionnaire specifically, and that's because the Young People's Centre is next door, so it's on the same site, and we will be reaching out to our harder to reach families, again using the partnerships that we already have. So maternity services, as you can imagine, are fully engaged, equal partners in this, and Doncaster and Bassett Law Hospital Trust will also help with any consultation around the building. No decision has been made. I think I must reassure you, this opportunity has arisen. With any change of any children's centre building, we would have to consult. So we could have just had consultation around a maternity hub, but we've used this as an opportunity to also look at family hubs. If the consultation says a family hub is what people prefer, then a lot more work will be happening in that community with local partners and families and young people to help shape that family hub. That will describe what services they want in there, what opening times they want, and so on. In terms of the funding, at the moment, we pay for the building. Maternity services don't pay us anything for the building at the moment. If the building was to become a maternity hub, they would take on all the costs, there would be a lease, and they would be charged a service charge. That is to cover the costs. At this moment in time, we're not looking for anything extra from maternity services, but that will be negotiated. This isn't about making profit. This is about making better use of the physical asset that we have in the area that, in my view, we're not making best use of at the moment. Maternity services are, which is great for them. And we have certainly had really good feedback from expectant parents and new parents in the area. I think that, just to confirm, this isn't about closing this building. This is about it being open more often and more services running from the building. In terms of the funding around that, again, if the consultation says they want it to be a family hub, we will sit with partners and work out how we split the costs really associated with managing that building. That includes things like cleaning, utility bills, Wi-Fi access, all those things. We're not talking about staffing, we're talking about just making sure that that building can operate. So again, it's not around profit, it's around covering our costs. I think that's it. And have I answered all your questions there, Councillor Welsh?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Councillor Barnfather, you indicated.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Absolutely welcome the report, and I thank the officer for that very detailed explanation and clarification. The recommendations are pretty self-explanatory. It's an option 1 and an option 2, which is about maximising the use of this county council owned and operated facility. A multi-service use of county council buildings is surely the way forward. We look across all sorts now of local authority organisations where we multi-occupy. The district councils have county council representatives present there. They have DWP representatives there. We make use now of a publicly owned building to provide the maximum amount of services which the community actually needs. Option 1 and option 2, there is no option 3 to close this building in the recommendations. It's very clear what the recommendations say, what the options are, and I totally support the paper.
Thank you, Councillor Barnfather. You don't want to think about that a little bit more? Any other questions or comments? No, thank you, Irene, much appreciated. Can I take this one to the vote? All of those in favour? Any against? Abstentions? Thank you. That's carried. Thank you. Item 13 is a paper on changes to the Young People's Service structure. There are 2 recommendations on page 96, which I move.
And I second those, Chair.
Thank you. Do I have any comments or observations on this paper? Councillor Meakin.
Thank you, Chair. Can I welcome this new targeted youth team in Ashfield that has been established for the past 6 months, as outlined in paragraph 4C on the report. This is something that our council's community safety team has been working on for some time, and I'm pleased that the 38,500 of funding has been secured by Ashfield District Council. Low-level antisocial behaviour from 10 to 14-year-olds has been a problem for some time in places like Coxmore Estate, which is part of my division. This money will do some way to alleviating the issues we have identified. We are also working with the violence reduction team, Operation Reach at Nottinghamshire Police to identify other ways of getting money to strengthen this team. This is a good example of district councils working with the council to identify a problem and deal with it directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Meakin. Councillor Williamson.
Thank you, Chairman. Just following on from that, I wanted to welcome the 4 new posts that have been established at the Mill Adventure Base in Ashfield. It's a great facility that we have backed by support from the National Lottery, with support from both districts and county councils. And just finish off by saying that we look forward to welcoming students from across Nottinghamshire to our wonderful facility, and I hope you'll encourage them to come down and take a look.
Thank you, Councillor Williamson. Any other comments or observations on this paper? No. I just have to comment, I'm not sure quite how we brought a county council paper which the Ashfield District Council seem to have taken to themselves, but I'm grateful that you welcome the paper. The work will continue. I mean, the purpose of this particular initiative is to free up the youth services team so that where they do have funding streams secured, be it from district partners or elsewhere, they are able to be more fleet of foot in implementing the schemes that are actually required within those communities, rather than having to wait until they can get a paper to committee and then we say yes or no about whether they can go ahead. So, you know, this is about empowering the leadership of the youth services team to actually deliver services where they're wanted and needed. I'm not allowing you to sub anymore, you giggle too much. So as far as this paper goes, I think it's very much to be welcomed. I think members are well aware that youth services is an area of service that I hold very close to my heart, and if I could, I would have them everywhere all the time. Any more comments or observations on this paper? In which case, all of those in favour? Thank you, that's carried. Item 14 is changes to the staffing establishment in the multi-agency safeguarding hub, the MASH. and the Early Help Unit. There are 2 recommendations on pages 109 and 110, which I move.
And I second those, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Do I have any comments or observations on this paper, please? Councillor Henry.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We welcome this report and the temporary expansion of the service, but this does not. Would it be better to reflect the current landscape in terms of the concerns around the vulnerable children and ensuring their safeguarding? And could we have a more detailed report about the MASH, as it is clearly an area of really paramount importance, really, but as the forecast demonstrates, is also a very difficult trend to predict, and particularly now that we are in the pandemic or just coming out of the pandemic.
Thank you, Councillor Henry. Do I have any more comments or observations before I look to officers? Can I just ask you to switch your mic off, Councillor Henry? Thank you. Will this be Lucy or Mr. Edwards? Thank you.
And Lucy can make any comment, but I think the report in essence does 2 things. In the short term, it talks about the challenge that I described earlier this morning to councillors about the increased demand. In the longer to medium term, it's also going to look at systems and processes and our partner approach to safeguarding referrals. So one of the things that I think the report says is that a lot of the referrals that come into the MASH don't meet the threshold for social care intervention. So we've got a lot of professional colleagues in the MASH doing a really good job actually of sifting through referrals that are never going to lead to social work intervention. And I think what we want is the right support to be provided to the right families at the right time. And people at the minute referring into the MASH because they're concerned about children and families, and I completely understand that, it's not always the most helpful thing to do. So we need to look at our whole partnership approach to the referrals out of into MASH, and some of the project capacity in this report will do that. And we'll also see if some of the systems and the processes in the MASH can be reviewed and made more straightforward whilst remaining safe. So I think the report's got 2 things. It's trying to manage the demand at the front door that's here at the minute, probably because of COVID and the lockdown and the challenges that there have been sort of after that. And it's also going to look at a MASH that's probably about 9-10 years in the process, and every year it's got busier and busier and busier. And we want to stop and ask ourselves the question, why is that? What are we doing about it? Why are colleagues not referring more to early help services, not dealing with concerns themselves? So there's some really, fundamental questions that the population of Nottinghamshire, I don't believe, has got more abusive towards its children every year for the last 10 years. I think we do a really, really good job of keeping children safe in Ofsted and in Nottinghamshire, and that's recognised by Ofsted. Perhaps now we've got to look at the way that all our professions work together to safeguard children and ask ourselves some fundamental questions. Is always referring to the MASH the best way of doing that? And I'm not convinced that it is.
Please go ahead.
What I was really focusing on is we've talked a lot about mental health of our children, in particular since the pandemic, and the concerns we have about vulnerable children is greater now because of those issues. Before it was about maybe just things that you could see happening, maybe see a child being neglected, maybe a child being abused, you could see that. But now we can't really see that as well because there's other things that's going on. So what I'm in terms of trying to make sure that we safeguard those children that are like that is how we're going to sort of get the MASH to do that type of work, or we have somebody else to do those sort of things. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's a really good point, and it may be for a lot of the emotional well-being challenges that children are experiencing at the minute, going through the MASH, which is a safeguarding hub, isn't the right thing to do. Actually, there are teams that support schools now with mental. Can't think of the name, but there are mental health teams that GPs can do that, pushing all our concerns about the welfare of children through a safeguarding front door. Actually, it just clogs up the safeguarding front door. And what we need to do is have a more widespread approach to meeting children's needs. There's some really good things that are going on in mental health, and committee gets a mental health update report, I think, every 6 months, and the last one was really positive. Nottinghamshire's pioneering things to do things differently. You Know Your Mind, where we helped children and families with personal budgets to support mental health issues, was something that was really, really positive. So, I think we need to do both things. We need to continue to look at the mental well-being of children and young people, but let's make sure that the MASH is a hub for safeguarding concerns, and it deals with them primarily.
Councillor Callaghan.
Actually working in the social and emotional mental health teams in schools, we have got some really, really good teams throughout Notts County Council. However, I think we do miss actually not working proactively together. We talk about working quite a lot together, and I personally and professionally believe if you've got the skills, no matter what team you're in it, if you can do it, then I think you should do it, and not actually having to keep waiting all the time. And maybe looking at that when you're looking at how we can better support the MASH to head off some of those referrals. Thank you.
So I was going to ask you a question for clarification. Do you work in the primary phase, secondary phase, or so primary phase? So you are still working amongst more maintained schools than academies? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Steve?
No, I think it's a really, really good point, actually. And some of the work that Lucy's leading on now is looking at a much more multidisciplinary approach. And we've already had some really useful sort of conversations with colleagues from domestic abuse services and from drug and alcohol services and from adult and children's mental health services. So I think, Councillor Callaghan, you're absolutely right. The more that we work together, we work better, but we've got to make sure that colleagues understand when the difference between making a safeguarding referral and about supporting the emotional health and well-being needs of children, because they're both really, really important, but they can be different. But absolutely completely agree about things are to do better by working together more, and we're already doing a lot of those things, but I think we can always be better at it.
Councillor Henry, you have another question.
Thank you. I know we talked about what's going on now with lots of children coming through now. I know you're asking for these posts. I'm assuming that you are going to recruit, or you already recruited for this post. I'm not sure how that's going to manage. And in the meantime, if you're not recruited yet, how are we managing those extra pressures that are placed on us at the moment?
So we have recruited to some of the posts. Not all, so we've put some additional capacity in the short term to meet the demand. People are, and how we cope in now, people just really care about what they're doing and they want to do a good job, and they're working flat out in really difficult circumstances. And we've moved people from other people that have got experience of working in the MASH. We've asked if they'd consider working there on a temporary basis, and some of them have agreed to do that. It's really vitally important that we support the MASH at this difficult time. It's a little bit like a dam where the water behind it is at risk of overflowing. Because if the MASH breaks, what essentially it will mean is all the referrals will just flood in to children's social care. Caseloads will increase, and my concern is that we won't see the wood for the trees, and those really vulnerable children could get missed. So the report that Lucy's done and the work that we're doing now to try and stabilise the system and make the processes better, absolutely vitally important. So we're putting our shoulder behind it really, and people are working really hard to manage it at the minute.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was worried about the workload of the existing staff and the pressures that bring and the knock-on effect of that, because what will happen that people then go off sick and so on, and then it just collapses. So thank you for the answer. Thanks.
Any other comments or observations from colleagues? No. I suppose I would make my own observations since I've been an elected member. When I was first elected in 2017, one of the early meetings that I did in the role at that time was to go to what was then the Nottinghamshire Safeguarding Children Board, and that was, as colleagues will know, the partnership between police, health, and us as a local authority. And I tell this story because I remember Steve sort of holding my hand because it was an early meeting and I was a non-participant member, so don't worry about it, nobody will be expecting too much of you today. And I think non-participant lasted about 5 minutes. I think Steve still remembers it sort of with fear and trepidation. And at that very first meeting that I attended, one of the most significant conversations was about the pressures on the MASH at the time. Pressures which both Steve and Lawrence identified as coming from the volumes of referrals that were then no further action. And the challenge at that time, the conversation that was had in that particular meeting, was partners were unwilling to look at their own referral routes and their own referral behaviours unless we told them that it was they who were doing it wrong. They who were referring too many no further action cases. And the challenge, of course, was that would potentially put even more work in the MASH and with officers to identify where those, call them false referrals, were coming from, which meant we were even more likely to fall over. Now, that's a conversation we were having 4 years ago, and in the intervening period, because the challenge I put out to partners was, if we make that effort at the MASH to identify where these false referrals are coming from, in the meantime, can you please go back to home base and assess your own processes and methods? Because if you don't do it with us, we could well fall over before we identify where the problem is. Now, in the intervening period, that has improved. It's not perfect, and also the structure of the board. The partnership working is now a partnership and not a board. So where we as a local authority used to carry that main responsibility and partners were at the table with us, we now have what I refer to more as a three-legged stool, where the three partner groups all share equal responsibility. But of course, that structural change has come in, still needing partners to evolve their own part and role in that, because this has been an evolving, changing structure. So it isn't a problem that we haven't had in the past. We have addressed it or sought to address it in the past. I think we have a much better structure in the partnership now than we had historically, because it's a partnership of three legs. Lawrence and his team certainly do a lot of work through the Safeguarding Assurance and Improvement Group, which is one of the elements of that partnership, and Councillor Anderson now sits on, to flag where issues lie. Obviously, Steve does also. So I suppose what I'm saying in part is we haven't just got to this point of stress over time because we've been in a declining situation or because COVID's put the extra pressures in. It's a place we've been at before, so it does show that we need some partnership education. Lucy's working in the background on a lot of the structural issues. Lawrence and his team with the data gathering is trying to flag with partners where those abortive leads are coming from. And Steve is attempting to put in the best resources now to make sure that we don't fall over before we can actually start to fix the issues. So again, it's trying to reassure you that there are lots of different elements in play to try and address not only dealing with the high volumes and the pressures, but to strip that back to origins and why we're getting these, and to try and rebase it. Yeah, so that's just to reassure as best I can there. If I don't have any more questions or comments, then I'll take this to the vote. All of those in favour? Thank you, that's carried. Item 15 is a report on unaccompanied asylum-seeking children and former asylum-seeking care leavers, and this is about remodelling service. There are 2 recommendations on page 118, which I move.
And I second those, Chair.
Thank you. Do I have any comments or observations on this report? Councillor Welsh.
Yeah, I just want to place on record the fact that we welcome this report. There seems to be a bit of a change of heart with regards to what happened in July 2017 when we walked away from this programme. It's all down there in paper and minuted and there for the world to see what happened, and it's also there to see what some of the comments that were made at the time. So I'm glad that there's a change of heart. In 2017, it was cited by the Children, Young People's Committee that one of the reasons by the chairman and others actually, that the reason that we were walking away from the settlement programme was due to government funding. So at the time, it was stated that the local authority was getting £33,000, but it was costing the local authority £44,000. I note that in June of this year, there have been changes to the National Transfer Scheme, and the Home Secretary actually announced additional funding for the local authorities. So is it the case that we're now doing this because we're now clawing back money to actually cover this? Has there been a change of heart with regards to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children? And this is because of the national issue with regards to what's going on in Afghanistan. We're proud to stand on a platform that we were against what happened in July 2017, and we're proud to support this today. But yeah, we'd like some clarity that this, if the government decides to change the funding, that this isn't something that we'll walk away from in a couple of years' time, that this is actually a commitment by this administration to support the most vulnerable, some of the most vulnerable children in the whole of the world.
Any other comments or questions before Councillor Barney?
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment. I don't think the recent impact of what we've seen on the news and that particular image of that parent holding their baby aloft in Afghanistan to be put on a flight could have been missed by any of us. And I think I'm delighted to have discovered that that baby was eventually reunited with their parents. However, for so many children, that's not the case. And I'd just also like to put on record that I'm delighted to see this report. I'm absolutely delighted to see that the authority are supporting children to this endeavour. There can be not a more needier group of people than young people and children who have been cut aloft from their families and then arrive on our shores. And I'm delighted to see that this administration and Nottinghamshire are welcoming these children onto our shores. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Barney. Councillor Williamson.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to wrap up, obviously, I wasn't here in 2017, so I couldn't possibly comment on what happened at the time. But I am absolutely delighted to see that this is coming before the committee, and I'm really happy with the recommendations, and I'm very happy that Nottinghamshire County Council is playing their role in rehousing what's quite rightly already been stated to be some of the most vulnerable people in the world. One of the areas that I have big concerns with is obviously the welfare of these young people, which is why I have to see this. But as an aside to the recommendations in the report, Chairman, I'd like to make a request to yourself and to the committee that as a committee we write to the MPs in Nottinghamshire, particularly in light of some of the comments that they've made over the last couple of weeks, deliberately conflating illegal immigration with genuine asylum seekers, and just remind all of our MPs that their words and their actions on social media can have real world implications for the safeguarding of these young people.
Thank you, Councillor Williamson. That was quite a heartfelt comment. Councillor Henry, would you like to say something?
Thank you, Chair. I really welcome this report. The only thing I wanted to know as well is how are we going to identify appropriate accommodation and care for these children when we have them here?
Thank you. I think before I hand over to officers, I'm just going to slightly refocus the debate, because we do seem to have strayed into the territory of the wider conversation about unaccompanied asylum seeking children. The report before you today is purely about restructuring the way that social workers deal with the young people who unaccompanied asylum seeking children who are in our care. So we set aside the this is no, Councillor.
We've been informed of by officers, so I suggest, you know, because our understanding is you're going back to the resettlement scheme. So
if we can address the report that's before us in the first instance, and I will comment on some of the wider, very valid points that have been made by colleagues. The report before us is about how we structure social work support for unaccompanied asylum seeking children in our care, be they children in care or care leavers, because we now have an obligation to support children up to the age of 25. So this report is purely about addressing how in a sense, how caseloads are allocated, and that we will have social workers who are dealing with a caseload comprising of unaccompanied asylum seeking children. The needs of those children, you will recognise, are frequently quite different to those of our domestic children in care. They've gone through completely different experiences. They have different cultural, religious and social needs. To have their care spread across a wide cohort of social workers can sometimes dilute the expertise that is often gained by social workers dealing with particular issues. So the purpose of the report before you today is to simply approve a structure which in effect creates specialist social workers dealing with those children. It will strengthen the support for those children and for those care leavers, because the social workers involved in their care will have more frequent contact and stronger contact with all of the other support mechanisms in the wider community third sector, whether it's housing associations, districts and boroughs. So that will be a positive. So that's this report. I think I was most drawn by Councillor Williamson's comments, because you are quite right. Negative commentary in social media from whatever source, be it a member of the public, an elected member, an MP, does not help the case of people who are in vulnerable circumstances. And some of the asylum seekers that we are seeing are amongst the most vulnerable in our society. So I accept your comment there. I'm not sure it is appropriate for this committee to take the action that you've requested, and I certainly don't think that it sits with the report before us. Councillor Williamson.
Sorry, but could you just clarify for me why you don't think it's appropriate for the Children and Young People's Committee to write to MPs and ask them to refrain from using language that is clearly going to put these children in danger and goes against the very ethos of the inclusive society and welcoming society that I believe Nottinghamshire to be? They are people of high public standing, and what they say has a much deeper impact. I just don't understand why it wouldn't be appropriate for us not to inform them of what's going on and ask them to refrain from negative language of the sort that's been used.
Perhaps I'm more a purist in terms of how I'm observing the papers in front of us, and I don't think that it's relevant to this particular report in the context that we're discussing it. Councillor Barnfather.
Thank you, Chair. I have to say I agree with you. I think that's a slippery slope that we find ourselves on when we, as an authority of whatever committee, whether it be this committee on this particular item or a Transport and Environment Committee or in fact any committee that we currently have here, feel the need to write to members of parliament. Members of parliament are elected by their communities. They're answerable to their communities. We have freedom of speech. We may disagree with their views. We may do it from a political, ideological standpoint. We may do it from a moral, conscionable standpoint. Whether we agree or disagree, we do that as individuals, not as an authority. It's not up to us to tell elected members at district councils or members of parliament or even at parish councils what they should and should not be saying. You know, they're big people. They stand and fall by their own words. And if the electorate don't like what they're saying, then they get voted out. That's democracy. That's the nature of, the system that we currently work under. I just think it's a very slippery slope once we start to take that decision that this committee disagrees with what an individual member of parliament may have said about that subject. So next time we'll have some member of parliament says, I don't believe in HS2. So does the Transport and Environment Committee write to them and say, well, that's very inflammatory because you are actually inciting people to not want to accept HS2 coming through. To me, it is a road we should not be going down. That does not preclude all of us having individual views within this chamber, and it does not preclude all of us as individual elected members writing to our own members of parliament, or indeed to every member of parliament, because that's our right in a democracy to express our personal views. But I don't think it's the remit of this committee.
Thank you, Councillor Barnfather. Just to go back to some of the earlier questions before I hand over to officers in terms of this report, if there is indeed anything else to be said. Councillor Welsh, you mentioned a 2017 decision to withdraw from the National Transfer Scheme. I was in post as a Vice Chairman at that time, and I was one of those who voted to withdraw from that scheme. Earlier on in the debates on the other papers, Councillor Henry raised very valid questions about children and young people's budget and how it is frequently overspent and what were we doing to manage those overspends. And I would say that was one example of taking a difficult decision based on the excessive costs that the shortfall in funding left this authority with. And had we continued in 2017 to participate in that National Transfer Scheme under the terms of funding that were prevailing, we would have been overspending significantly more year on year on year, which would have added to the budget pressures which we've already spoken about today. So I do not apologise for voting the way I did at that time on the basis of the situation that we found ourselves in. As a result of authorities like us taking that position, and over time and with vigorous lobbying to government, both from council level, from East Midlands Council level, and through other groups and bodies like the Local Government Association, the different leadership networks, government has revised its funding scheme. You are correct that we are now participating in the National Transfer Scheme. There is still a notional shortfall in funding. That notional shortfall is something that we will bear on our children and young people service budgets. It is not of the magnitude that it was 4 years ago, and we have taken the decision that we can support those young people through what you might call a moral imperative, because taking the position we previously did has led to the situation we now have and the improved funding streams. So I hold to the decision previously taken. I'm glad to be in a position now serving that we can take a different position and support more young people. And then if I go on from that also, I think it's important to note that whilst we refer to unaccompanied asylum seeking children. They may arrive with us from through different routes. These could be children who arrive spontaneously because they're dropped off the back of a lorry at a service station in our county area. They could come through the national transfer scheme, with which we are now willingly participating, and they can come through other resettlement schemes. Councillor Barney gave the example of what would appear to have been an unaccompanied child being rescued in quite stark photography, but who is now with their family. And I think it's also fair to say, therefore, that in both the Syrian and Afghan schemes, we do not expect to see unaccompanied asylum-seeking children because we are seeking to resettle family groups. So the children that we're referring to, the ones who are in our care because they are unaccompanied, are not coming from the same schemes as the Syrian resettlement scheme or the Afghan one necessarily. They are quite different. So, it's particularly important that members of this committee grasp the differences and the nuances when we're using language about certain groups of people and certain support mechanisms. And I do not use language like illegal immigrants. We are talking about a group of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. That's the subject of this paper today. We're talking very specifically about how we structure the delivery of our social work support services to that group of children. Now, obviously, I've spoken quite stridently. I don't know if there is anything in process terms that officers would like to add about this particular paper or not.
Don't think so.
Thank you. And do I have any other questions or comments from members? In which case, can I take this to the vote? All of those in favour? Thank you, that's unanimous. And the final item on today's agenda is the work programme. There's one recommendation, page 122, which I move.
Formally second, Chairman.
Thank you. Any comments or questions on this? I do have a couple of observations if other members don't. So it was just to recap on the MASH item. The question was raised about a more detailed report coming forward. And I note that within the recommendations for that item, one was that we receive a 6-monthly update. I just wanted to clarify with officers through what reporting mechanism and with what frequency does this committee receive more detailed information about the work of the MASH. We obviously get core data sets at different times. We see reports from the NSCP, but because I didn't pick up the answer to that particular question on the MASH item, it's just to seek some reassurance that there may be reports already in play that would satisfy that request for more detailed information.
I think the MASH work's covered. The demand on the MASH covered in the quarterly performance report, but I think for the report that we've done today, we'll be reporting back, I think we said 6 months, to talk about the developments and the proposals that we've got. So committee will continue to be fully informed.
Thank you. So if there are no other questions, we've concluded. Oh, Councillor Welsh.
In light of the last report, will we be having regular updates with regards to this on the plan, with regards to what's happening, with regards to how many children we are having, on what the impact is, etc., etc.? Will that be on the?
You're talking about the numbers of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children.
Yeah, just a regular update with to what is.
Again, I'll clarify with officers, but I think that is picked up. Thank you, Lawrence.
I think we can add it to the quarterly performance report. I don't think it's in there currently, but we can certainly ask for that to be added into that reporting.
Yeah. I think I will just make one other point on that particular subject, because it's clearly the one that's touched the most raw nerves today, and it's a very, very sensitive and emotive subject. I was asked a question when I was at a community event a couple of weeks ago, because there was a lot in the news about the Afghan resettlement programme as an example, and a lady approached me to ask whether we were participating in any resettlement schemes of any kind, because she simply didn't know, and she felt it was something that we should be doing. And it was the fact that she was as I was talking to her, she was stressing that she didn't know, and I made the point, and again, it's very personal to my style and approach, that I could reassure her that we were participating, that we were supporting families and unaccompanied children, but that she was not going to be seeing me on the front of a newspaper shaking hands with an asylum seeker anytime soon, because it is not only an emotive subject for members and those of us who are trying to serve our communities and what is in effect a wider community. I don't think it's incumbent on me to raise my profile by exploiting somebody who's just travelled half the globe to get to a place that they feel safe. And if somebody wants to have contact with me, that's fine. But I'm not going to be telling somebody in the Retford Times that we are doing X, Y, and Z for asylum seekers if there is the risk that some of the very commentary that Councillor Williamson identified may then circulate or lead to difficulties for them trying to settle in their new homes and their new lives. And it is very nuanced. We know morally that we should behave in a certain way, but I'm not going to be drawing attention to what we're doing or drawing attention to those people who actually just need some time to breathe, relax and feel safe. So that's my personal speech. We will continue to do what we are doing, but we won't be trumpeting it because I don't think it's an appropriate place to share the work. On which note, thank you for indulging me in my last rant. We maybe should have stopped the live stream a couple of minutes ago. Thank you for your attendance today, members.